The restaurant shimmered under golden lights, every table perfectly arranged, every sound a soft melody of laughter and clinking glasses. It was the kind of place where only the wealthy dined, and tonight was no exception. The moment Ethan Cole, the billionaire CEO of Cole Industries, stepped through the doors, the quiet hum of conversation shifted. Heads turned subtly, whispers moved across the room like ripples in water. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, Ethan carried himself with an air of effortless authority. His face, though handsome, was unreadable, the expression of a man used to control, not conversation. Success had shaped him, but it had also built walls around him, walls no one dared to climb. He nodded curtly at the staff as the host guided him and his executives to the private dining area at the back. Across the room, Lila Turner, a young waitress with tired eyes and an honest smile, noticed the commotion. She had worked at the restaurant for 3 years, long enough to know that serving people like Ethan Cole required more than skill. It required patience. Lila was not like the rest of the staff, who whispered in awe of the billionaire's fortune. For her, he was just another customer, another table to serve before the night ended and she could return home to her small apartment, where her mother rested weekly, waiting for her. Lila's life was built on quiet strength. Every shift, every smile she gave, was another small step toward survival. When the manager called out her name and assigned her to Ethan's table, she nodded politely, unaware that this would be the night her world, and his, would change. The meal began like many others. Ethan spoke little, his attention buried in his phone and the murmurs of his executives. They discussed deals, mergers, and market shares, their words polished but cold. Lila moved between tables gracefully, her hands steady even under pressure. She placed plates before them with care, her soft voice barely breaking the tension-filled air. For a while, everything went smoothly. The hum of conversation, the flicker of candlelight, the faint music from the piano in the corner. But beneath the calm surface, tension was brewing. 2 of Ethan's investors, both competitive and proud, began to argue quietly over a contract detail. At first, it was nothing more than a disagreement. Then, their voices grew louder, sharper, cutting through the refined atmosphere of the restaurant. One slammed his hand on the table, startling a nearby couple. The other stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. Guests began to turn their heads, whispers rising. Ethan's jaw tightened as he stood, his tall frame commanding attention. "Enough," he said, his voice low but firm. Yet the men ignored him, their pride feeding the fire. For a moment, everything felt on the edge of chaos. Lila, standing nearby with a tray of drinks, froze. She could feel the unease spreading through the room, the fear that something worse might happen. The manager glanced nervously toward the table, unsure whether to intervene. But before anyone could act, a glass tipped over, spilling red wine across the tablecloth, staining the white fabric like a wound. Lila's instincts took over. Without hesitation, she set down her tray and stepped forward, her movements calm and precise. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a whisper of reason. Her hands moved quickly, removing the broken glass, replacing napkins, soothing both men with quiet assurance. There was something about her tone, firm but kind, that seemed to pull the air back into balance. The arguing men looked at her, surprised, and then slowly sat down again. The restaurant fell silent for a heartbeat, the storm passing as quickly as it came. Ethan watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. He had seen employees panic, seen people crumble under pressure. But this young woman stood in the middle of chaos, as if it were nothing more than a small inconvenience. When she looked up at him, her brown eyes calm and sincere, something unfamiliar stirred inside him, not admiration, not curiosity, but a quiet recognition of strength he hadn't expected to find here, in a simple waitress. The evening continued, but nothing felt quite the same. Ethan, though he said little, kept watching her from the corner of his eye, and Lila, unaware of how her composure had left an impression on the man who ruled empires, simply continued her work, her focus steady, her heart still beating fast from the storm that had almost unfolded. Outside, the city lights flickered, unaware that inside this golden restaurant, two very different lives had just crossed paths, one built on power, the other on perseverance, and neither would ever be the same again. The tension that had been brewing at the table finally snapped. One moment, the voices of Ethan Cole's investors were low and sharp. The next, they erupted into shouting that broke through the quiet elegance of the restaurant like thunder. The clinking of glasses and soft piano music stopped instantly. All eyes turned toward the private corner where the powerful men sat, faces flushed with anger. One investor, his patience gone, shoved the other across the table. The sudden movement knocked over bottles of wine, sending red liquid spilling like a stain of chaos. The glass shattered as it hit the floor, the sound echoing across the room. Guests gasped, waiters froze, and fear rippled through the air. The polished perfection of the restaurant, the laughter, the confidence, the charm, vanished in an instant. Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. His usually calm, composed face showed clear frustration. "That's enough," he barked, but his voice only seemed to add to the noise. The two men ignored him, still trading angry words, as panic spread among nearby guests. One woman stood from her seat in alarm, clutching her child. The waitstaff exchanged nervous glances, no one daring to move. And yet, amid the rising chaos, Lila Turner did not freeze. Her body reacted before her mind could. She set the tray in her hands carefully on a nearby table and moved forward with calm, deliberate steps. The world around her seemed too slow, her instincts sharper than fear. When one of the toppled chairs began to fall toward another guest, she reached out and caught it in time, her movements precise and quick. "It's all right," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "Everyone, please step back." Her words were soft, yet they carried authority, the kind that comes not from power, but from composure. Something in her tone made people listen. The frightened guests obeyed, backing away as she began to create space around the table. Another waiter tried to help, but Lila raised her hand slightly. "It's okay, I've got it," she said, not unkindly. She crouched down to pick up broken glass, careful and calm, as if the world wasn't falling apart around her. The restaurant manager finally appeared, but even he seemed to hesitate, watching this young waitress take charge as though she'd done it 100 times before. Ethan, standing only a few feet away, was silent. His sharp eyes followed her every move, the precision of her hands, the steadiness of her breathing, the way she spoke with quiet strength instead of panic. For years, he had worked with people who cracked under pressure, who only knew how to lead with authority, never empathy. But this woman, this waitress, was controlling the situation with both. Slowly, the shouting began to fade. The investors, now aware of the scene they had caused, fell silent, embarrassment replacing anger. One muttered an apology, another looked down, shame burning across his face. Lila didn't scold or glare. She simply nodded and continued to clean up the spilled wine, her hands moving gracefully. "Please take a moment to calm down," she said gently. "No harm's done. Let's not let this ruin the evening." Her words seemed to release the last of the tension, and soon the restaurant began to breathe again. Guests sat down, waiters returned to their duties, and the piano player hesitantly struck a note. Within minutes, the chaos was gone, replaced by a strange, respectful quiet. Ethan remained still, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes had changed. When she finally stood up, brushing her hands on her apron, their eyes met. In that single glance, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. True composure, the kind born from experience and heart, not training. Lila didn't look proud or flustered. She simply looked at him with calm understanding, as if what she had done was nothing extraordinary. Then she turned and walked away, returning to her work as though she hadn't just commanded an entire room of powerful people into silence. Ethan watched her go, his thoughts unusually quiet. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about business or control. He was thinking about her, the waitress with a voice strong enough to calm chaos, and a presence that had, in just a few moments, reminded him of something he thought he had lost, the ability to feel human again. When the restaurant finally returned to its calm rhythm, the sound of quiet conversation filled the air once more. The crisis had passed, but Ethan Cole couldn't shake the image of the young waitress who had handled the situation better than anyone in his entire company ever could. While others froze or panicked, she had acted with precision, grace, and an unshakable calm that even he, a man used to controlling boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, could not have managed so effortlessly. For the rest of the evening, his attention kept drifting toward her. She moved through the restaurant with quiet confidence, never seeking praise or attention. Her calm face and gentle smile seemed to restore order to every table she passed. When his guests finally left and the dining hall began to empty, Ethan stayed behind, his mind unusually restless. He was not the kind of man who indulged curiosity, but something about her demanded understanding. He called the manager over. "Send that waitress, the one from earlier, to my table," he said, his tone softer than usual. Moments later, Lila Turner approached, her apron slightly stained from the evening rush, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked politely. Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking. "How did you stay so calm earlier?" His question was direct, but there was a note of genuine curiosity in his voice. Most people would have been terrified standing in the middle of that chaos, yet she had moved as if she had been trained for it. Lila hesitated, unsure how much to say. "My mother always said the mind is strongest when the heart is steady," she began, her tone soft but certain. Ethan tilted his head, intrigued. "That's not something most people learn at home," he said. Lila looked down, the corners of her mouth curving into a small, thoughtful smile. "I used to study psychology," she said quietly. "Human behavior, emotional control, things like that. I wanted to become a counselor, help people deal with stress and anxiety. I even started training in crisis management." She paused for a moment, her expression changing slightly, but life changed. Her voice trailed off, and Ethan could hear the weight in her silence. "Changed how?" he asked, though his tone had lost its edge. It was no longer the demand of a CEO, but the question of a man who wanted to understand. Lila's eyes flickered with a faint sadness as she replied, "My mother fell ill. I had to drop out of college and work full-time to support her. The tuition, the treatments, it was too much." She gave a small shrug, as though she didn't want his pity. "So, I started here. It's not what I planned, but it's honest work." Ethan didn't respond immediately. For a long moment, he simply watched her, his thoughts unexpectedly tangled. He had spent years surrounded by people who bragged about their education, their skills, their achievements. Yet here stood a woman who had none of the luxury or privilege he had, and still, she carried a strength that most of his top executives lacked. He noticed how she didn't seek sympathy or attention, only dignity. Her eyes, though tired, held depth and understanding. She didn't just see situations, she saw people. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar, not admiration for power, but for humility. "You handled yourself like a professional," he said finally. "You have talent." Lila smiled softly. "Thank you, sir. But it's not talent," she replied. "It's practice. Life doesn't always give you calm moments, so I learned to create them myself." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He realized she was right. Calm wasn't something one was given. It was something one built. As she turned to leave, Ethan found himself calling out, "Miss Turner." She stopped, looking back curiously. "You said you studied human behavior," he continued. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at me?" The question seemed to surprise her. She hesitated, searching his face before replying softly, "A man who's learned how to win everything, except peace." Her answer struck him like a quiet truth he had avoided for years. As she walked away, he sat back in his chair, stunned by how a single conversation with a waitress had unsettled the certainty of a man who thought he knew it all. For the first time in a long while, the billionaire who commanded boardrooms and controlled empires felt small, not in weakness, but in wonder. And as the door of the restaurant closed behind her, Ethan Cole realized that perhaps strength wasn't about power or perfection. It was about understanding something Lila Turner had mastered long before he ever would. In the days that followed, Ethan Cole found himself haunted by the memory of Lila Turner, the waitress with the calm voice and the steady heart. He couldn't explain why, but her words kept echoing in his mind. "Life doesn't always give you calm moments, so I learned to create them myself." It wasn't something he could ignore. For years, Ethan had lived in a world defined by profit, numbers, and competition, where people were valued only for what they could deliver. But Lila had reminded him of something deeper, a truth he had forgotten beneath the weight of his success. So, a few days later, to his own surprise, he returned to the restaurant, not as the powerful CEO everyone whispered about, but as a man searching for understanding. When Lila saw him sitting quietly at one of her tables, she was taken aback. "Back again, Mr. Cole?" she asked, with a polite smile. "You could say that," he replied. "I think I owe you another conversation." She hesitated, but eventually sat with him during her break. What began as small talk turned into something more, a genuine conversation about life. Ethan asked questions he hadn't asked anyone in years. "What keeps you going?" he asked once. Lila smiled faintly. "Hope," she said, "and the belief that kindness still matters, even when the world forgets it." They talked about choices, regrets, and the meaning of success. Lila spoke with honesty, her words simple yet profound. "Success without compassion is just emptiness wearing a crown," she said softly, and Ethan felt each word strike something inside him. He found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in a long while. The more she spoke, the more he realized how far he had drifted from the person he once wanted to be. That night, he returned home, feeling restless, but strangely alive. For years, his days had followed a script: meetings, deals, deadlines. But now he was thinking about things that couldn't be measured in spreadsheets: people, purpose, and peace. A week later, as he prepared for his company's annual leadership retreat, an idea struck him. His executives, though brilliant, lacked emotional understanding. They were efficient, but disconnected, much like he had been. Maybe Lila could help them see what he had begun to understand. The next morning, he returned to the restaurant once more. Lila looked surprised when he approached her. "I have a proposal," he said. "I'd like you to speak at my company's leadership retreat next week. A short session on emotional intelligence and human connection." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Me, Mr. Cole, I'm not a speaker. I serve food, not advice." Ethan shook his head with a small smile. "You do more than serve food, Lila. You understand people better than anyone I've met. That's what my company needs." After a moment's hesitation, she agreed, though her hands trembled slightly. "All right," she said softly, "but I can't promise much." "You don't need to," he replied. "Just be yourself." The following week, the retreat was held at a quiet resort overlooking a lake. The executives, all dressed in sharp suits, were confused when Ethan introduced the young woman standing at the front of the room. "This is Miss Lila Turner," he said simply. She's here to teach us something we all forgot, how to connect. The room was skeptical at first, but when Lila began to speak, the silence deepened. Her voice was warm yet confident, her words carrying both strength and vulnerability. She spoke about empathy, understanding, and how true leadership came from compassion, not control. She shared her own story, her dreams, her hardships, her mother's illness, not to seek pity, but to show that strength often grows from struggle. Her words flowed like calm water, washing away the stiffness in the room. For the first time, the executives didn't see a waitress, they saw wisdom. Some nodded quietly, others wiped their eyes. Even the most hardened managers leaned forward, listening intently. At the back of the room, Ethan watched, pride swelling in his chest. The woman who once carried trays and cleaned tables was now teaching lessons that no business school could ever offer. When she finished, the room erupted in quiet applause, genuine and heartfelt. Lila looked toward Ethan, her eyes shining with disbelief and gratitude, and at that moment, he realized something profound, that sometimes, the greatest teachers in life aren't the ones with titles or wealth, but those who live with empathy, humility, and grace. Months passed, and with each sunrise, Ethan Cole became a different man. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was deep and genuine. His company, once known for its ruthless efficiency and cold professionalism, began to feel alive with purpose. Employees noticed it first, the way their CEO now greeted them by name, the way he asked about their families, or how he listened during meetings instead of merely commanding. He began new initiatives, creating programs that supported employees with children or aging parents. The man who once measured success only in profits now measured it in smiles, in stories, in lives touched. The change rippled beyond the walls of his skyscraper. He founded a scholarship program for underprivileged students, naming it after Grace Turner, Lila's mother. When she learned of it, Lila couldn't speak for a moment. Tears filled her eyes. She had never asked for anything, yet somehow, Ethan had given her something more valuable than money, recognition of her mother's strength and love. But beyond all of that, something deeper had shifted inside him. He had rediscovered humanity, the simple act of caring. It wasn't the grand speeches or the charity work that changed him. It was the quiet moments when he remembered Lila's words, the way she had seen the world with empathy instead of judgment. And so, one golden evening, long after the world had stopped expecting anything from their unusual connection, Ethan found himself walking once again toward the little restaurant where it all began. The air was calm, carrying the faint scent of rain, and the city lights were beginning to flicker awake. Through the window, he saw her, Lila Turner, wiping down tables, her hair tied back, her blue uniform glowing under the soft lights. The restaurant was almost empty, just the quiet hum of background music filling the space. When she turned and saw him, surprise flashed in her eyes, followed by a warm smile. "Mr. Cole," she said, setting her cloth aside. "Back again?" He smiled softly. "I guess I never really left," he replied. She laughed gently, shaking her head. "You're not here for dinner, are you?" "No," he said, his voice calm and sincere. "I came to say thank you." She frowned slightly, puzzled. "For what?" He took a slow breath, his eyes thoughtful. "You didn't just save me that night in the restaurant," he said. "You reminded me what really matters." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, the world seemed to pause around them. Lila's eyes softened, glistening under the dim lights. She looked at him, not as a billionaire, not as a powerful man, but as someone who had found his way back to being human. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "saving someone doesn't mean stopping danger. It means helping them see the good they forgot." Ethan nodded slowly, her words sinking deep into his heart. There was a long silence, not awkward, but full of unspoken gratitude and mutual respect. Outside, The last light of sunset painted the windows gold, bathing them both in a warm glow. It was as if time itself had frozen to honor the moment, the crossing of two very different lives, both changed forever by one act of kindness. In that instant, there was no billionaire and no waitress, no wealth and no struggle, just two people connected by understanding. Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from happiness, but from peace. "You were right," he said softly. "The mind is strongest when the heart is steady." Lila chuckled quietly, her eyes shining. "And it seems yours finally is." He laughed under his breath, and for the first time in a long while, the sound was genuine, unguarded. The restaurant lights flickered slightly as the city outside glowed brighter. Neither of them said anything more. There was no need. The air between them carried everything: gratitude, respect, friendship, and a silent acknowledgement that their paths had changed each other forever. As Ethan walked out into the evening, the door closing gently behind him, Lila stood watching, her heart full but calm. She didn't see a billionaire walking away. She saw a man reborn, proof that compassion still had the power to change the hardest of hearts. The city lights reflected in her eyes, and she smiled to herself, knowing that sometimes the truest rescues happen not with strength or power, but with kindness, the kind that heals the soul.